The Cod Wars between the 1950s and 1970s, Iceland, that small volcanic island with a population smaller than a single London borough, decided to challenge the United Kingdom and its mighty Royal Navy. And the reason? For centuries, Iceland had been a fishing center, but by the 20th century, British fishing vessels were greedily trawling for cod. Newly independent and in a troublesome mood, Iceland decided in 1958 to extend its exclusive fishing zone from 4 to 12 nautical miles. Their message to the British was clear: remove your nets. But the British ignored them and sent their vessels directly into the same area. The Icelandic Coast Guard responded by turning the situation into a high-seas bumper car chase. Eventually, Britain relented. Then came the Second Cod War, when Iceland extended its zone to 50 miles. This time, however, they brought a secret weapon: net-cutting shears. Imagine British fishing vessels hauling in their catch only to discover their nets had been cut. It was a war of naval pranks, but it cost the British millions and a great deal of pride. The Royal Navy was called in, but even their massive cannons couldn't stop the Icelanders from outmaneuvering them with skill. By the Third Cod War, Iceland had escalated the situation further. The fishing zone extended to 200 miles, thus declaring its sovereignty over the entire North Atlantic. The British were somewhat upset by this, but Iceland held a trump card: NATO. Iceland threatened to withdraw from the alliance, and since NATO desperately needed that strategically located island during the Cold War, the United Kingdom had no choice but to back down. The Lobster War. It's the 1960s, and France is facing a problem. It has lost its African colonies, meaning its lobster supply is gone. Then, as a glimmer of hope, news spread about the lobster-rich waters off Brazil. The French began to act, but since they couldn't simply admit they wanted to steal Brazil's lobsters, they resorted to a clever trick. They claimed to be conducting research on lobster nurseries. Despite their suspicions, Brazil allowed some boats to enter. Surprisingly, the French weren't conducting any research at all, only looking for ways to make quick money. When Brazil discovered the ruse, they stopped it. But the French returned, this time amused, fishing in even more distant areas. What followed was a dramatic maritime saga. Brazil seized French boats, and the French claimed that lobsters swim like fish, so they belonged to everyone, while Brazil insisted that lobsters don't swim but walk on its territory. Tensions escalated in 1963 when France, in an overreaction, sent a destructive force to protect its lobsters. Brazil, for its part, mobilized its fleet, but most of its soldiers were on leave. The French destroyer, in a laughable turnaround, retreated to refuel, leaving Brazil victorious and wondering if it had won by withdrawing. In the end, not a single shot was fired, and the two sides signed an agreement allowing French vessels to fish in exchange for a share of the profits for Brazilian fishermen. The Football War. In 1969, tensions between El Salvador and Honduras were at their peak. Honduras had a land reform program that evicted small farmers and handed their land over to large corporations. Hondurans were unhappy, and when Salvadoran migrants began working on those lands, things worsened. Riots and protests erupted, with Honduras accusing them of stealing jobs and resources and beginning to evict them. More than 100,000 Salvadorans were furious. Just as this anger was about to explode, the two countries met in the 1970 World Cup qualifiers. Bad timing indeed. The matches were disastrous. Fights between fans, flag burnings. When El Salvador lost the first match, their players were pelted with garbage. In San Salvador, the Hindu team was met with stones. In the decisive third match, El Salvador won, but by then it was no longer about football. It was war. In July 1969, El Salvador launched a full-scale invasion of Honduras. At first, they controlled the territory, but by July 15th, Honduras began launching airstrikes. A ceasefire was reached on July 8th, and El Salvador finally withdrew on August 2nd after threats of sanctions. All this because of a match. Not exactly, but football was the spark that ignited the conflict. The Pastry War. A conflict between France and Mexico between 1838 and 1839. Imagine you're a French pastry chef in Mexico, and suddenly Mexican soldiers loot your shop. What do? If you're Monsieur Montel, you go straight to the King of France and demand 60,000 pesos in compensation for a shop worth no more than 1,000 pesos. What a bargain. The Mexicans claimed they simply hadn't paid for what they ate. In either case, this mess escalated into something much bigger. France decided that war was the best way to resolve this sweet dispute. The French Prime Minister demanded a huge sum of 600,000 pesos. The Mexicans didn't pay, so France blockaded the ports, bombarded the forts of San Juan, and even occupied Veracruz. With trade at a standstill, the Mexicans resorted to smuggling goods through Texas. But in the end, after all the fighting, the French withdrew, and Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos. But guess what? The payment was never made. And you know what that means? France returned for the second round in 1861. But that's another story.